Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the Moonshark! Hey, give it up, please. Give it up. All yours.
Okay, evening. Those missed it up. So that's what
Nice jump.
Okay, was anyone here at the Spring Awakening? That was 2 parties ago.
Yes!
Yeah. And I had a little story then about somebody called Robin. I don't know if any of you remember that.
Oh yeah.
So this is a little bit of a prequel. Hands up if you've ever been on a really shit holiday with your family. Robin squeezed hard, watching his knuckles turn white, and tried to block out the sound of the children's screams. Then he closed his eyes tightly against the pain of the sunlight and focused on the familiar throbbing ache of his temples. His resolve was receding with the inevitability of the tide going out, physically leaving his body as if a plug had been pulled. He loosened his grip on the arms of the sun lounger. Right on cue, another shrieking brat came flying down the plastic slide and landed in the pool next to him like a turd in a toilet. He cursed this hell of a holiday once more. Robin checked his watch to see how long it had taken him to decide to break today's promise to himself. His momentary disappointment lifted the lid of suppressed memory long enough for a snapshot of his latest humiliation to leak into the forefront of his brain. Habit wheeled out a momentary attempt at defending his actions. The holiday camp was the embodiment of grimness, just as he'd warned her every time she cut another token out of the tabloid rag to pay for it. She'd insisted, though, as she always did, then stubbornly held on to the decision like a Staffordshire Bull Terrier hanging off a toddler's face. They needed the break, she'd said. Needed precious family time together, away from the relentless soul-crushing tedium of work, relief from the endless drop-off pick-up deadline cycle of the school routine, respite from the nightly numbing of alcohol. So they'd packed up the car, pulled the boy out of class and taken the ferry to this, a decrepit refugee camp of cardboard-walled static caravans grouped around a concrete swimming pool and a facsimile Wetherspoons bar infested with the cream of the red-top reading masses. He wanted to tell himself he'd given it a chance, that he loved his wife and son enough to give even the minimum effort to curb his behaviour and make the holiday a success. But the counsellor in their couples therapy had pressed the point. Honesty to oneself was a key step on the road to contentment. So he had to admit the shock of the horror of this place had overwhelmed him within moments of arriving. He'd pleaded with her, begged to find somewhere else to stay, whatever the cost, or just to turn the car around and head home without even unpacking. She'd had none of it. Of course, she'd played the pantomime of family democracy and put it to the vote, leaving their son once more in the position of deciding which parent to side with. Even in moments like these, Robin had to admire the way his son faced up to his situation as the sole progeny of a couple who no longer loved each other enough to provide him a sibling. The boy was used to being exploited in this way, and he was conscientiously even-handed in his approach towards them, even in the face of considerable intimidation. But faced with the apparent prospect of losing the holiday they'd spent weeks building up as a carnival of childish pleasures, he'd solemnly looked his father in the eye and voted him down, biting his lip in fear at the reaction. The boy's bravery was as admirable as Robin's reaction had been shameful. A fuck not quite muttered enough not to reach the child's ears. The car door slammed and a march straight to the bar. He'd hoped the victory had been worth it to her while she struggled with the ropes securing their luggage to the roof rack. He tied them extra tightly, with half a mind on just this eventuality. Evidently she'd managed, as they'd been gone when he'd stumbled back to their caravan at whatever time it had been when the barmaid woke him from his slumber. Surprisingly, the door hadn't been locked. And once he picked himself up off the ground, having nearly yanked it from its hinges, he'd headed inside to find out where she'd decided he was sleeping. Misjudging the step completely, he reached out desperately into the darkness, taking out a pile of washing up before crashing face first into the table and collapsing on the floor amidst the pans and plates and the screaming of the boy. The lights had come on and he'd opened his eyes to an expression of pure terror on his son's face as he was swept away into the rear bedroom in the arms of his mother. Having calmed him to a persistent sob, she'd returned to silently open the door and usher him out into the darkness. When he'd awoken, uncomfortably contorted between two of the cheap plastic garden chairs in front of the van, the car was gone. She'd left a note, scribbled in purple crayon and stuck to the van door. His heart had sunk as he read it. They'd be back later. In the meantime, he was to think about what he'd done, and then they'd talk. He hated talking. It involved way too much listening. And so here he was, 2 hours later, at the pool, and all he could think about was having a drink. Just one beer to take the edge off, that's all he needed. Besides, he couldn't bear staying put. In front of him, an unbearably obnoxious man was teaching his daughter to swim. Or rather, his daughter was thrashing around in the swimming pool, while the man repeatedly shouted that she looked like she was drowning, interspersed with additional observations that she was fucking useless, a fucking spastic, and a fucking embarrassment to her dead mother. Yes, a lovely, cold, glistening pint of strong continental lager in a tall glass. Maybe a packet of cashews. That would sort him right out. Everywhere he looked, he was surrounded by acres of pale, saggy, nausea-inducing flesh crammed into ill-fitting swimwear. All around the pool, men with guts so pronounced they dwarfed his own protuberance, basked like walruses in the weak sunshine, studiously ignoring their offspring with noses buried in the very tabloid that had brought them all to this repugnant place. He could barely tear his morbid gaze from these oblivious morons, uniformly poured into tiny designer trunks that did nothing but emphasize the diminutive nature of their genitalia in comparison to their stomachs. Robin had long given in to the ravages of age and lifestyle, wearily cognizant of his expanding waistline and the likely state of his interior. He accepted that he wouldn't reach an advanced age, possibly wouldn't even make it to retirement. But since he had no desire to eke out a final few years in extreme poverty, propped up in a chair in a piss-smelling nursing home like his parents, this didn't bother him unduly. Besides, what sort of world would it be by then? Certainly not one he wanted to be part of, with an ever more downtrodden proletariat, kept docile with ever shinier things and distracted by ever more pointless, talentless supposed celebrities, while a handful of sociopathic multi-billionaires hoovered up everything of worth, shat all over the planet and then fucked off to live in their own private space stations. He can almost taste it now. A pint of Kronenberg would give respite from the headache it shakes. Just the one. He didn't want things getting out of hand. If the men at the pool were faring badly, the women had truly been ravaged by time. And while the fathers were supine, the mothers were never stationary for more than a fleeting moment. Even though he was wearing impenetrable black wraparound sunglasses, Robin could find nowhere to comfortably rest his gaze that wasn't immediately invaded by an expanse of hideous cellulite and varicose veins. Giant crumpled tits and huge thighs peppered with bruises badoinkadoinked incessantly. Flabby, caesarean-scarred stomachs, muscles permanently rent asunder from the rigours of pregnancy, lurched and loomed. Why wouldn't they just fucking cover themselves up? Instead, they lumbered around in the wake of their snotty broods in tiny bikinis that left nothing to the imagination. Wherever he looked, one would be bending over to expose stray tufts of pubic hair or an escaping nipple. And then they'd adjust themselves, as if the weight of his gaze was a physical thing, and they knew that despite actively trying not to watch anything, he'd seen it all. Or perhaps not. The obtrusive thoughts were back. The juxtaposition of these awful specimens with their still physically unsullied offspring was jarring. The children were beautiful in comparison, this far ahead of their inevitable decline. Maybe they'd all be better off if their parents somehow died or something. It couldn't be much worse than the path of their destiny. Maybe one or two would make something of themselves. He wondered what that would be. Perhaps they'd be really, really good at street dance. He stopped himself and realised he'd been staring at the children long enough that someone might think he was a paedophile. He couldn't decide if he was being paranoid. He just couldn't tell these days, and without his family with him, he was just a fat, sweaty, balding, middle-aged man at the swimming pool, staring at the kids. Beer then. Should probably try and eat something substantial too, maybe a burger. In front of him, the shouty, swearing swimming lesson was apparently coming to an end. Short-arsed Dad had had enough and proceeded to loudly combust without the slightest regard for his audience. "Fine, fucking drown then," he spat, threw the towel he'd been carrying down and stomped off into the distance. The girl stared after him. She was still for a moment, then wiped her eyes and slowly pulled herself out of the pool with great effort. She wrapped the towel self-consciously about herself, and then, after a pause and a deep breath, got laboriously to her feet. She hopped over to a sun lounger and bent down to pick up a bag and a pair of crutches before hobbling off in pursuit of her father. As she passed, Robin gave her an encouraging nod, expending all his available energy and trying not to look creepy. No, it was time. Time to get away from this terrible place. His self-loathing was plumbing new depths. He pulled on his t-shirt and made for the bar. Robin didn't know what time the obnoxious little man and his daughter had sat down next to him. They'd been there when he'd awoken from an alcohol-induced nap. The place was now filled with families eating chips and pizza, while on a ramshackle stage, some scared-looking French teenagers performed Gangnam Style, surrounded by grubby toddlers mimicking their every move. The man sipped furiously from a pint of Stella, filling the intervening periods with a torrent of jabber. He stared straight ahead vacantly, uninterested if Robin was listening, unloading in bursts of bitter vitriol. The harshness of life on benefits, the burden of his 14-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy, the inconvenient death of his wife. Gemma, the daughter, had clearly heard it all before and rooted her gaze to the scratched surface of the table, only meeting Robin's eye momentarily, though long enough to communicate her embarrassment, shame and hurt with painful clarity. Robin twisted his face into something he hoped represented a reassuring, empathetic smile, at the same time conscious that he could very well just be leering. Gemma responded with a smile of her own, revealing for the first time the metallic handiwork of some maniacal dentist, scaffolded haphazardly across her joke shop teeth. Robin focused on preventing himself from looking away and doggedly held the girl's gaze. Inside, he asked himself whether it was better to be sat here in this precise situation than back at the caravan with his wife, having one of their talks. He pondered the pros and cons and the short and long-term consequences, and came to the conclusion that actually, and slightly surprisingly, it was. He stood and announced he was going to the bar, asking both what they were drinking. Later, when he could be sure it was late enough, he made his excuses and left, staggering back between bewilderingly identical rows of caravans, until finally recognising his car, and next to it the two plastic chairs, adorned with their unmistakable pillow and sleeping bag message. He picked up the sleeping bag and threw it at the caravan door, flicking V-signs and thrusting his pelvis in retort. Then he slumped into a chair and passed out. He dreamt. He dreamt of a time before all of this. A mythical time, without complication. A glorious sunshine-filled time of fun and friends and spontaneity and dancing and drinking and drugs and girls and blowjobs. Blowjobs. Robin loved blowjobs. He loved a full pair of luscious lips wrapped around his cock. A tight, twisting grip, working the shaft up and down quickly, the other hand cupping the balls, gently squeezing. God, that was good. Oh, what? No, that wasn't good. Not good at all. His body jerked once, uncontrollably, and he vomited all over himself. A piercing scream brought him immediately back into consciousness. Suddenly he was sober and staring into the darkness. He heard muffled movement in the caravan behind him, and then a light flicked on. The stained beige roller blind covering the kitchen window pulled down and then snapped violently upwards to reveal the scrunched up face of his wife staring straight out at him. Their eyes locked, and he was able to gauge the new level of her disgust. He looked down to see the figure kneeling before his crotch. The light reflected sadly up at him from the metal in her mouth as she wiped the undigested mixture of cheeseburger and beer from her face. Then, failing to find her crutches, she called him a cunt and crawled off into the darkness, past the caravan window that his son now looked out at him from, with an expression of confusion and pity and shame.